What turns a brilliant mind into a weapon of destruction? What drives an educated man to become a hunter of innocent people? And what force could possibly transform the most feared religious extremist of his generation into history's most passionate defender of the very cause he tried to annihilate? This is a story about fanaticism, transformation, and one of the most shocking reversals in human history. It begins with a man who believed so deeply in his cause that he would stop at nothing to eliminate what he saw as a dangerous threat to everything sacred. Picture an intellectual powerhouse in his early 30s, fluent in multiple languages, trained in the finest schools, with a mind sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous. He wasn't just educated, he was brilliant. He wasn't just religious, he was fanatical. And he wasn't just committed to his beliefs, he was willing to kill for them. This man had received the highest religious education available in his time. Think of him as a combination of Harvard Law graduate, theological scholar, and special forces operative, all rolled into one. He knew every sacred text by heart, could debate any theological point with devastating precision, and had the political connections to turn his convictions into official policy. But what made him truly terrifying wasn't his intelligence or his connections. It was his absolute certainty that he was doing God's work. Have you ever met someone so convinced of their righteousness that they became dangerous? Someone whose moral certainty made them capable of unspeakable acts? That was this man. He had made it his personal mission to hunt down and destroy every member of a growing religious movement that he believed threatened the very foundation of his faith. These weren't just philosophical disagreements, this was war. And he was winning. The members of this sect spoke of a executed criminal, as if he were divine. They claimed this man had risen from the dead. They were converting others, growing in number, and worst of all, they were challenging everything he held sacred. To him, they weren't just wrong, they were dangerous heretics who needed to be stopped at any cost. His reputation preceded him wherever he went. When families heard he was coming to their town, they would pack up and flee in the middle of the night. Children would wake up screaming from nightmares about him. Even hardened criminals would cross to the other side of the street to avoid his gaze. He didn't just arrest people, he orchestrated their executions. He didn't just disagree with their beliefs, he sought to completely eradicate them from existence. He was systematic, efficient, and utterly merciless. In his mind, every person he destroyed was a victory for righteousness. Think about the psychology of a man like this. He wasn't evil in his own eyes, quite the opposite. He saw himself as a hero, a defender of truth, a warrior for God. This is what made him so dangerous. He had turned his intelligence, his passion, and his religious fervor into a weapon of mass destruction. But here's what's fascinating about extremism. It often comes from the deepest places of conviction. This man didn't become a persecutor because he didn't care about truth. He became one because he cared too much. He didn't hunt people because he lacked passion. He did it because his passion had consumed him entirely. On this particular day, he was traveling to a city where he planned his most ambitious raid yet. He had official documents, a team of soldiers, and a list of names. Dozens of families would be destroyed before the week was out. He rode with the confidence of a man who had never known defeat, who had never questioned his methods, who had never doubted his cause. The sun was high in the sky as his convoy moved along the dusty road. He was probably reviewing his strategy, thinking about how quickly he could round up the heretics, imagining the fear in their eyes when they realized their fate. He was in his element, powerful, purposeful, unstoppable. And then, at exactly midday, everything changed. Picture the most intense light you've ever seen, not just bright, but blindingly, overwhelmingly brilliant. Light that doesn't just illuminate but seems to come from everywhere at once. Light that makes the sun itself seem dim by comparison. This light didn't just appear. It erupted around them like an explosion of pure radiance. His horse reared in terror, his soldiers cried out in panic, and he, this man who had never shown fear, who had faced down angry mobs and dangerous criminals without flinching, he fell to the ground like a child. But the light was just the beginning. What came next would shatter every certainty he had ever held. A voice spoke his name, not the name everyone knew him by, but his birth name, spoken with an intimacy that suggested the speaker knew him better than he knew himself. The voice asked him a question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Why are you persecuting me? Not my people, or my followers, but me. The voice was claiming a personal connection to every person he had hurt, every family he had destroyed, every life he had taken. When he managed to stammer out a response asking who was speaking to him, the answer destroyed his world. It was the very person whose followers he had been hunting. The executed criminal he had dismissed as a fraud was speaking to him from beyond death. claiming to be not just alive, but divine. In that moment, everything he thought he knew about reality crumbled. If this voice was real, then everything he had done wasn't righteous. It was monstrous. Every person he had arrested wasn't a heretic. They were innocent. Every execution he had orchestrated wasn't justice. It was murder. When he tried to stand up, he realized something was wrong. The brilliant light that had revealed so much truth to his mind had stolen something from his body, his sight. The man who had always seen everything clearly, who had been so certain of his vision of righteousness, could no longer see anything at all. His soldiers led him like a helpless child to the very city where he had planned to continue his persecution. But instead of arriving as a hunter, he arrived as prey. Instead of bringing terror, he brought confusion. The man who had never shown vulnerability was now completely dependent on others for his most basic needs. For 3 days and 3 nights, he sat in darkness. Not just the physical darkness of his blindness, but the spiritual darkness of a man whose entire worldview had been shattered. He couldn't eat, he couldn't drink, he could barely speak. Everything he had built his life on had collapsed in the space of a single conversation. Imagine the psychological torment of those 3 days. Every person he had hurt appeared in his mind's eye. Every family he had destroyed haunted his thoughts. Every moment of violence he had orchestrated played out in vivid detail. The hunter had become his own prey, trapped by the weight of his own actions. But something else was happening during those dark hours. The same voice that had destroyed his certainty began to rebuild his understanding. He started to comprehend that the movement he had tried to destroy was under a threat to truth. It was truth itself. The people he had persecuted weren't enemies of God, they were God's beloved children. When his sight finally returned, it wasn't just his physical vision that had been restored. He could see clearly for the first time in his life, and what he saw horrified and humbled him. He had been so wrong about everything that mattered. The transformation that followed was so complete, so radical, that he literally changed his name. The hunter became the hunted. His former allies became his enemies. The people he had once terrorized became his new family. The movement he had tried to destroy became his life's mission. But here's what makes this story even more remarkable. He didn't just switch sides. He became the most passionate, most effective, most influential advocate for the very cause he had once opposed. His conversion wasn't quiet or gradual. It was explosive and total. Think about the courage this transformation required. He knew exactly what happened to people who joined this movement, because he had been the one making it happen to them. He knew the dangers, the persecution, the potential for suffering, and yet he embraced it all willingly. His former colleagues were baffled and enraged. How could their most effective weapon suddenly turn against them? Some thought he had lost his mind. Others suspected it was an elaborate trick. Many wanted him dead. The people he had persecuted were equally confused. Could they trust the man who had destroyed their families? Was this conversion genuine? Or was it the ultimate deception? How do you forgive someone who has caused you such pain? But as time passed, his authenticity became undeniable. He didn't just preach his new beliefs, he suffered for them. He was beaten, imprisoned, shipwrecked, and constantly threatened with death. The man who had once inflicted persecution now endured it with remarkable grace. He traveled thousands of miles, planted hundreds of churches, and wrote letters that would influence billions of people across to millennia. His intellectual gifts, once used for destruction, became instruments of hope and healing. His passion, once turned toward violence, became a force for love and redemption. The most fascinating aspect of his transformation wasn't just what he became, but how he used what he had been. His deep knowledge of religious law helped him explain his new faith to skeptics. His experience with suffering helped him comfort others in their pain. Even his former role as persecutor gave him unique credibility. When he spoke about forgiveness and grace, he never tried to hide his past or minimize his crimes. Instead, he spoke openly about his former life, using it as evidence of how dramatically people can change. He became living proof that no one is beyond redemption, no one is too far gone, no one is beyond the reach of transforming love. His story became a template for countless other conversions throughout history, from former gang members who become community leaders to extremists who work for peace. His dramatic transformation has inspired millions of people to believe that change is possible. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of his story is how he dealt with his guilt. He could have been crushed by the weight of what he had done. Instead, he channeled his remorse into remarkable productivity. He used his regret as fuel for his mission, his guilt as motivation for his service. Have you ever experienced a complete change of heart about something you once believed passionately? Have you ever discovered that something you thought was right was actually terribly wrong? Share your story in the comments below. His letters, written from prison cells and hostile territories, contain some of the most beautiful reflections on love, hope, and human potential ever penned. The man who once spread fear became a poet of redemption. The intellectual who once used his mind as a weapon transformed it into an instrument of healing. One of his most famous writings speaks about love being patient and kind, not envious or boastful, not arrogant or rude. These weren't just pretty words from a philosopher. They were hard-won insights from a man who had learned the devastating consequences of lovelessness. He wrote about being all things to all people, a remarkable sentiment from someone who had once been so rigid in his thinking. He spoke about running a race and fighting a good fight, using the language of competition and warfare but redirecting it toward positive ends. Perhaps most remarkably, he claimed that his former life as a persecutor had actually qualified him for his new role. He argued that his experience of being forgiven such terrible crimes made him uniquely able to offer that same forgiveness to others. His influence extended far beyond his lifetime. His theological writings became foundational texts for billions of believers. His missionary journeys established communities that lasted for centuries. His model of radical transformation gave hope to countless people who thought they were beyond redemption. But who was this man whose story reads like the ultimate plot twist? Who was this intellectual giant who became a monster and then a saint? Who was this persecutor who became the greatest missionary in history? His name was Saul of Tarsus, but the world knows him as Paul the Apostle. And his story became one of the most powerful testimonies to the possibility of human transformation ever recorded. Paul's conversion wasn't just a personal triumph. It changed the course of world history. The man who had tried to destroy a small Jewish sect ended up helping it become a global religion. The persecutor became the most effective missionary the movement ever had. His story reminds us that no one is beyond redemption, no transformation is impossible, and sometimes our greatest weaknesses can become our greatest strengths. The hunter truly became the hunted, but in the process he also became something far greater than either. What voice is calling you to transformation? What deeply held belief might need to be reconsidered? What change are you resisting that might actually be the key to your greatest purpose? Paul's story proves that it's never too late to change direction, never too late to seek forgiveness, never too late to become the person you were meant to be. Sometimes the most dramatic transformations come from the most unexpected places. Like this video if Paul's incredible transformation inspired you, and subscribe for more biblical stories that will challenge how you think about redemption, change, and human potential. Comment below with your thoughts on how people can experience radical transformation in their lives. And speaking of transformation, next week we're rediving into the story of a man who experienced the most terrifying test of faith imaginable, a father who was asked to sacrifice his own son. You won't believe how this ancient story connects to modern dilemmas about sacrifice, trust, and doing the right thing when it costs you everything. See you in the next video.